Hiya, it's your host, Mariah. Welcome to Black History Quest, Oregon Black Pioneers History Research and Conversation Program, sponsored by the Collins Foundation. Now, as always, we're coming to you live on the Oregon Black Pioneers Facebook and YouTube pages, and we so appreciate you for spending an hour of your day with us. If you can't stick around for the whole show, you'll be able to find this and every episode of BHQ on our YouTube page. But what is Oregon Black Pioneers? Well, we're Oregon's only statewide historical society dedicated to preserving and presenting the experiences of people of African descent here in Oregon. Since 1993, we've helped illuminate this seldom told history through a variety of ways, including books, walking tours, which we just kicked off recently, exhibits that you can find online and throughout the state, free lesson plans that are available to download on our website. So if you're an educator, please check those out, and programs like this one. Now, this is our 19th episode of Black History Quest. And Black History Quest is an OBP original program designed to uncover and share Black history here in Oregon. Thanks to the support of the Collins Foundation, we've been able to hire local researchers, or history investigators, as we call them, to dive deep into the unknown and share their findings here on our virtual show. Our goal is to continually deepen our understanding of Oregon's Black history, while the show also offers a peek behind the curtain to see what historical research is actually like. So thanks for joining us live every other month to hear about this new research and the process to uncover it. And as I mentioned before, as always, every episode is archived on our YouTube channel for our fellow Oregon Black Pioneers to watch in the future. For those fellow pioneers joining us live, don't forget to share your questions in the chat section of the live stream so we can discuss them on air after the presentation. But with all of that out of the way, let's get started. Now, tonight, we are so lucky to have Milo Reed as our history investigator. Milo Reed is a historian and writer who works all across the state of Oregon. He's passionate about African American cultural history, historic cemeteries, and Black history in Oregon. Milo has a unique ability to scour print and multimedia archives to find previously unused primary sources and create original content about underexplored historical subjects. He has an MA in history from the University of Mississippi and a BA in history from Southern Illinois University. Sounds like the perfect candidate for a history investigator for Black History Quest. So I'd like to give a warm welcome to Milo Reed.
Hey, everyone.
Hi,
hey,
Milo.
Mariah.
Hey. Thank you so much for joining us and being this episode's history investigator. We're so thrilled to have you here on Black History Quest.
Thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yay. So Milo, as you know, all Black History Quest investigations begin with a source that sparked some sort of interest. So can you start by telling us what your source was that you were looking into and what it was that caught your attention about it?
Yeah, honestly, my source wasn't, like an image or a book or anything like that. My source was Kathy Galbraith, who may be familiar to folks who have done historic preservation work. Kathy Galbraith was the original executive director of the Architectural Heritage Center and the Bosco Milligan Foundation. And yeah, this all started from just a casual conversation about hunting and camping.
Oh, I love that. That's such an intriguing start. I'm curious, what sort of questions did you have about the source that she brought to your attention, and what did you think it might represent before you did any of the research?
She didn't have much information. She basically just gave me a name and the fact that Black people at some point hunted and camped at this spot. So yeah, it was kind of an open-ended thing. And yeah, I just wanted more information about the site itself. And also, I'd been seeing images for years that I thought possibly could have been taken at this site. So that was one of the things that I really wanted to kind of drill down was, could I prove that any of these images that I thought were possibly from this place, were they actually from this place?
Oh, okay, awesome. So you had all these pieces that you were hoping to maybe connect. Well, that's, I think, I'm certainly interested and excited, and I know we all are, to learn more. So I'll turn it over to you to present.
All right, sounds good. Let me see if I can get the hang of this. All right, there we go. All right, my big question is, what was Seaside Sunflower Camp? And as I stated in the beginning, my source was actually Kathy Galbraith. We were working on a project, specifically the multi-property documentation form for Portland and the Black community that was completed a couple of years ago with the help of Caitlin Ewers and a few other folks, Kimberly Moreland. And yeah, I was just casually talking with Kathy about, the fact that I was going fishing and camping. And she, as she was wont to do, just kind of started talking about like how that tied in with history. And she mentioned, well, there was this camp at one point that was kind of a vacation property and people fished there and camped overnight. I don't know much about it. And that was really all she had. And as a lot of historians will do, I have my little box or bag of, slips of paper that has things like that on it, like just a name, a fragment of an idea, something like that. And I kind of wrote that down and put it off to the side and kind of kept it in my head for a few years. And it just kind of stuck around. I wasn't able to do much with it. I really didn't know where else to go. Because the first place that I typically would check would be cornerstones of the community. And Kathy was actually instrumental in organizing this, researching and writing it. It's a great starting point anytime you're researching Black history in Portland. The narrative is very reliable, very well researched, but the true kind of gem of this project is the Buildings of Portland's African American History Index. And it's a remarkable, remarkable source. It's, probably 1,000 plus names of people and places associated with Black history in Portland, along with addresses associated with them. And it's not quite exactly footnoted, but Kathy did make it a point to include, a newspaper and a few dates that you could probably find some information about each entry. But unfortunately, what Kathy knew was what she put in cornerstones of the community. So there really wasn't much about the Sunflower Camp. And I really didn't investigate it that much anyway. I think I glanced at it once, like right after she told me, and then kind of filed it away. I did want to note that the Architectural Heritage Center is currently digitizing Kathy's papers, her collection, and that includes a lot of oral histories that I don't think anyone besides her has heard, most certainly not in quite some time. And yeah, that should be a really great resource moving forward. I'm actually extremely excited to see that work when it's done. But with that being said, I, of course, kind of set this idea off to the side and really didn't think much about it until I started working for Multnomah County Library after that previous project had wrapped up. And while working for Multnomah County Library, I was connected with this project that was called Our Story. And in the end, I actually ended up becoming kind of the curator of the project. And Our Story was a digital archive featuring photos, newspapers, almost anything you can think of that were held in archives around the city, county, and I think a few places outside of Portland and Multnomah County. So around the state, we'll just say that too. And it really did focus on Portland's Black community. And the thing with Our Story that I really wanted to do was to provide more information about the subjects portrayed in these photographs, videos, newspapers, so on and so forth. Because for me, history is all about context. It's not quite about events or objects. Those are all very important, but you really do want to explain kind of the why, when it comes to like an event, like why did this occur? What were the forces behind this event that kind of shaped things the way that they were? In terms of photographs, who's in the photographs? What are they doing? Why are they there? And it's really important to me to be able to get this additional information about these people featured in photographs. And just from working on Our Story, I managed to really kind of develop my research skills to kind of answer those kind of questions about, hey, who's in this picture? And as an example, this is an image that I'm sure a lot of folks out there have seen. At one point, I was involved with a project that worked a lot with on Vanport. And anytime you see the word Vanport, usually you're going to see this image on the left. That is Nina Maylock. And one day we were doing a screening for this Vanport project, and a woman walked up to me and said, hey, you guys are, using a photo of my cousin. And I said, oh, well, tell me more. And that was Gloria Cash. And she kind of explained to me that, hey, somehow City of Portland archives ended up with some of my family photographs. They get used quite a bit. That's my cousin. And told me her name, told me a little bit about her, how she ended up at Vanport. And I said, oh, cool. And that really did stick with me. So much so that the next time Gloria Cash approached me when I was working at Multnomah County Library on the Our Story project, she, kind of said the same thing. It had been several years, and she spoke to a lot of people that evening, but there was a flyer for Our Story, and it featured one of these images, the one on the left. The one in the middle is typically paired with this image. I believe in the original article that these photos were taken for to kind of contrast, what a workday looked like and then what Sunday looked like for Miss Locke. And just in kind of talking with me, Gloria Cash kind of said the same thing. Hey, that's a photo of my family. And I was like, yes, that's your cousin Nina and your Gloria. We met several times. I could tell it was really important to her that I remembered her, knew her cousin's name, and that I was acknowledging the fact that her family was basically allowing folks to use these images. And it really stuck with me how important that seemed to be to her. And I kind of made that a part of my mission. Anytime I did research and used a photograph, I always wanted to include not only a date and a location, but also identify and name anyone I could see in a photograph. And I really do think that in a lot of cases, we see a lot of things on social media where people will post a photo of, a Black person, a historic photograph, and not really give much context. And we really do need to remember these are people's family photographs, and we should honor them as such. And that's always my mission as far as like doing research, especially here in Portland. This is another example from our story. This is a photograph that also gets used quite a bit. Typically, the fellow on the right is called Protest Man in a lot of the captions that I've seen. And as you can see, he's also in the middle of the photograph on the right. And this photo intrigued me for quite some time. Just in doing our story research, I was able to figure out, roughly when this photograph was taken, which protest this was at. Found lots of newspaper articles, but I wasn't able to really drill down on who this man was. In fact, I even asked Ron Herndon, who was responsible for organizing this protest, and he couldn't recall this gentleman's name. And yeah, just as a part of the Our Story project, we had a video component. And one of the things that I would do is I would show people photographs from the Our Story collection. And of all people, the late, great Avell Gordley, when I showed her this photograph, said, "Oh my goodness, that's Linnell Hill." And I was slightly taken aback, and I was kind of said, you know him? And she was like, yes, that's my brother's childhood best friend. The two of them used to babysit me, and they would feed me mustard just to see my face scrunch up, which was a really adorable story. I was not expecting that. And it was just one of those great moments that kind of made me realize that this is why this work is important. It's really, really important to me to be able to kind of provide these names and get this information for folks and get it out there. In fact, I was able to turn that information over to the Portland City Archives, and they were able to add Mr. Hill's name into the metadata. And just kind of an aside, the gentleman on the right there, on the right photograph and in the background with the headband, he only identified himself as a Brave Bear from Estacada. I've never been able to find any additional information about him, but he also kind of tends to draw, your eye kind of tends to get drawn to him as well in that photograph. But just from, doing this research on our story, I found that sources of information that can provide more kind of context to these photographs are things like newspapers, things like oral histories, and of course, community members like, the late Avell Gordley. And Mr. Hill's a really interesting case because he actually was in the newspaper several times. He was a longshoreman who was involved in a lawsuit that sought to end discrimination on the docks in Portland. In fact, there's an OHS article that features him heavily, and Oregon Historical Society has a pretty long oral history featuring him as well. So once I had his name, it was fairly easy to track down that information as well. And that just came from, asking someone a question. But from there, you really can gather a lot of information as long as you have, a rough date and a name. And good newspaper databases. More on that in a moment. Back to the Sunflower Camp, though. Kind of the breakthrough moment for me was working on a different project for the Clackamas County Historical Society. And a person working there at the time, Lizzie Cleary, basically, said, hey, we're trying to find more information about kind of Black leisure activities, specifically in the outdoors. And I immediately thought, Sunflower Camp. That could be something I could look into. And I hadn't really poked around on the subject, in quite some time. This is several years later. My conversation with Kathy was probably 2017. This was 2022. And I kind of thought, well, let me look around and see if I can find a newspaper that features some information about the Sunflower Camp. And I was only able to find a single newspaper. And these are fine. This is actually from Portland State University Library's Rutherford collection, which I believe Kathy also used as well when the Rutherfords were still alive. She relied on them a lot as a source for information and things like newspapers. And it was one single newspaper article, and this is what I found was this advertisement. And as you can see, it says Sunflower Camp. It gives you a name, J.W. Curry, gives a location, Seaside, Oregon, and it gives you a rough time frame before World War II, kind of, Great Depression-ish. But that was enough for me to go off of. But, I initially thought, man, it'd be, absolutely great if somebody would go ahead and do something like digitize the Portland Advocate. And it turned out that in 2019, the University of Oregon had done just that. If you've never used this database, Historic Oregon Newspapers is a great resource. Me personally, I tend to use Newsbank a lot through Multnomah County Library, home of the Historical Oregon Journal and Historical Oregonian. But this is a really great resource for newspapers across the state. And when I talk about, having a single newspaper being an okay source, really you want a full run of a newspaper, especially if it's digitized. These sources are great because they're searchable. The files are easy to download, crop, and organize. It's comprehensive when you have a full run, so you're unlikely to really miss anything. If you're looking for, not quite a needle in a haystack, but a person's name, it's, kind of a crapshoot as to whether or not you're going to come up with that name from a single newspaper. So having a full run allows you to more or less rule out whether or not that person was featured in this publication at any given time. And also, newspapers are very reliable. Biases of, reporters and writers aside, you get a really good idea of what was happening on the ground in a place day to day. And with a newspaper for a population like Portland, which, at the time was relatively small, you needed to fill pages. So they would include stories about all kinds of things. I could talk quite a bit about some of the interesting articles that I find just kind of in doing my research, but I'll skip that for today. And just to note, this newspaper was published by Beatrice Morrow Kennedy. That is a photograph of her that was also used in our story. I don't know if you all noticed that as well. But she was a civil rights activist, pioneer, and she will actually feature heavily in the story of the Sunflower Camp. So I had my little bit of information, I had a couple of names to go off of, and I had my full digitized run of a newspaper. So I was ready to go. Ultimately, the project with Clackamas County Historical Society didn't quite work out. I wasn't quite sure where the Sunflower Camp was located, but wasn't in Clackamas County. So I had to kind of continue the research on my own, just, out of my own curiosity at that point, and then try and find like places to present it or things like that. But first, I really needed more information on the actual camp itself and its proprietor. And just in searching, and this is what I like to call a wreck your life research. So whenever you have a long run of a newspaper and you're searching for a person's name or searching for a location or searching for, say, a guitar amplifier company, you're going to return a lot of results. In this case, I want to say there were, between the names that I came up with, probably anywhere from 500 to maybe a little over 1,000 articles to go through. At this point, as a historian, I have to look through this stuff myself. And it can take anywhere from a few weeks to a few months to get through that much information. But with the Sunflower Camp, I was able to do so. And going through chronologically, I was able to come up with a pretty good timeline and also kind of a biography for J.W. Curry. Today, I'm going to focus more on the actual camp itself and the properties that he owned, and maybe talk about Curry a little bit here and there. But from what I was able to locate, J.W. Curry opened his first rental property in Seaside in 1923. And kind of the genesis of it was that he was a buffet car porter at the SP&S railway line that went between Seaside and Portland. And in doing these runs, he kind of realized there weren't a whole lot of places for Black folks to stay when they went to Seaside or on the coast. There were a few folks who would offer lodging, most famously the Badgers. I know a lot of folks are familiar with them. Zachary Stocks has done some really great research on them and done some presentations. Dr. Chelsea Vaughn, who I've also worked with a little bit on this project, has also done some research on the badgers. So they feature heavily kind of in this idea of places where Black people could stay on the coast, because their property also lasted quite a bit longer. But Curry, in seeing there was a dearth of options, decided to come up with a place of his own. And he basically found a lot and put up several tents. And he would advertise in the Advocate. And as far as I can tell, he didn't advertise anywhere else. There was only one advertisement that I found, I believe in the Oregonian, much later towards the end of the life of the camp, that featured an advertisement by Curry. But he would advertise in the Advocate. You would contact him at his home or call him on his phone number. And you would arrange to stay at the property. And as you can see from the advertisements, they were just tents. They were furnished. We'll see some more advertisements a bit later, but there was a housekeeper on site, and Curry would also visit as well and stay occasionally too. But these were just simple tents that allowed people to spend time at the coast in the summer. And this is very important because at the turn of the 20th century, this idea of kind of using your leisure time to summer at the coast or at the ocean or at the beach became kind of a mark of middle-class identity. And to me, this really looked like kind of identity construction among Portland's Black community and Black Oregonians as well. And it was really intriguing, and just kind of fitting in with that, there was also a society column that ran in the Advocate as well. And what I found was, over the run of Curry's properties, they were always featured as kind of a destination in these society columns. This is one early one in the realm of society, and it actually mentions George Hardin. And Portland history nerds will know that George Hardin was the first Black police officer in Portland. At this point, though, he was probably working at the Rocky Butte jail, and he worked for Multnomah County as well. But the really interesting thing that I always point out about Portland history and what makes it really fun to kind of like study Portland's Black population and just kind of read about them is it's a pretty small community. And if you do enough research, you really kind of get to know these names, and they pop up all the time. And that was just kind of my experience in looking through these articles, was like very familiar names would come up from time to time as being folks who stayed at the various properties that Curry operated. And I hadn't quite pieced it together yet, but this was kind of my first clue of what the Sunflower Camp actually was. Originally, I thought that J.W. Curry only operated one property. And from this article on the left, as you can see, Curry operated the Curry Colony, or Curry's Tents. They were known by various things among folks in the Advocate and things like that. But that was one property. And after a very successful, first year, J.W. Curry purchased a property that I believe already had a cottage on it, and he installed several tents. This was kind of in the middle of the year, and the wife of Ralph Flowers, who also appears in our story, and his family is very well known, but she actually rents the cottage for the whole rest of the year and summers there. And to me, once again, this is just kind of a mark of kind of middle class identity, being able to summer at the coast or summer at the beach. And I found it really fascinating that, here's a name that I recognize, and here's a whole other separate property. And it's just a lot of rich detail. And as you can see in the center, that is probably the first advertisement for the Sunflower Camp, at this point just known as the Sunflower Furnished Cottages. And from then on, the Sunflower Camp was featured in the society pages in the Advocate pretty much every column for every summer until the enterprise closed. And it was kind of a locus of Black social life in Portland. There would be day trippers who would stop by to visit their friends. You would have people who were working at the coast also who would seek lodging at the Sunflower Camp. This one I found really interesting. On the left, if you look, it's J.W. Curry answering accusations from a Miss McLemore that she was unfairly charged or deceived in some way by Mr. Curry for rooms that she had secured, tents that she had secured for a group of caddies who were working at the Seaside golf course. This indicates to me that there was very little lodging available, especially for young black men, and that the Sunflower Camp provided a place for them to stay. It's also possible that this was Curry's other establishment as well, the Curry colony or the Curry tents. They tended to not differentiate in a lot of cases, so it's difficult to tell who's staying where. But as you can see, not only on the left do we have this complaint from Mr. Curry, which kind of tells you how, pretty much everything made it into the newspapers at this point. But on the right, if you look at the bottom, you can see where they actually list the young men who are working as caddies, all of them by name. To me, this really kind of like pointed out that if you need information, no matter how granular it is, it's always worth it to check a newspaper. You might find what you're looking for. It's also worth pointing out towards the top that there's a list of folks who visited the Sunflower Camp. And this is something I was actually just talking with Dr. Chelsea Vaughn about a week or two ago. You'll notice that the Badgers actually came to Sunflower Camp and socialized there. Or that, people would go to their property and then go back to the Sunflower Camp. So it wasn't like there was any real competition or they were like beefing or anything like that, or it wasn't like Jets versus Sharks. Everyone socialized and had a good time. And as you can see on this evening, there was a very nice bonfire that also included Miss Morrow, who I'm pretty sure is Beatrice Morrow Kennedy. And yeah, it just kind of really points to this idea that this is a very small community and a lot of familiar names would pop up as guests at the Sunflower Camp. It's also worth noting that this bonfire went on until 2 a.m. I'm not exactly sure what they were doing, but this was during Prohibition. It was, in fact, 1926. And I looked and looked and looked. There were no mentions of alcohol or any untoward activities. So this also suggests to me that a lot of these society columns are kind of about projecting and constructing this kind of idea of black respectability is what it would have been called. Yeah, especially among black scholars, this is something that gets discussed. It's kind of contentious as to whether or not like this is right or, if these people are really respectable or so on and so forth. But to me, this is a marker that this was a conscious construction of class that was, basically done by guests at the Sunflower Camp. And I had lots and lots of articles basically, pointing out the comings and goings of the Sunflower Camp. There were a lot of activities that, one would associate with kind of middle-class vacationing, specifically croquet, which in my research, and there are a few books about croquet and class, croquet was considered to be an acceptable middle-class sport because it wasn't super competitive and there was no contact. So men and women could play in mixed groups, children could play. It was considered to be kind of a genteel sport. It really came into its own in the late 19th century in Great Britain, but it did make its way across the pond to the United States and kind of became a mainstay of kind of middle-class leisure. But all these activities, as far as I can tell, maybe weren't solely to project an identity, but I do feel like that was part of it, was kind of trying to construct this identity through leisure, which is kind of a newer field of history that folks are looking into. I actually am kind of looking for secondary sources to kind of bolster this. I think I may be kind of early on to this idea. There are a few really good pieces, though, that I was able to come across and are really worth reading if you're interested. The one thing I didn't come across in these early kind of research forays was the exact location of the camp. And that was because most of the advertisements actually just list Mr. Curry's home phone number and his home address in Portland. It took a while, but I believe I mentioned earlier there was an Oregonian advertisement later on that actually did list an address for the Sunflower Camp itself. And I'm looking at the 1931 city directory. By that point, J.W. Curry was actually living at the camp, it looks like, at least part-time, possibly full-time. Just from kind of like looking around, I was able to find the Sanborn Fire Insurance maps. If you ever need a historical map that'll tell you what was happening on the ground in an area, Sanborn maps are a really great place to go anywhere pretty much across the country. We have a few other resources here in Portland, like the Portland Block Book and a few others, but Sanborn Fire Insurance maps are kind of the gold standard when you're trying to locate a property and kind of what was there on a given date. And just based on my research and looking around, this is probably the site of the Sunflower Camp. Whenever I introduce this, topic to folks or start talking with them about it, everyone kind of starts chin stroking and kind of, you know, saying where they believe it was. But for me, this is my best guess for where the property is located. And that is, I believe, currently the site of the Seaside Assembly of God. And the road actually changed. At the time, it would have been South 7th Street, which is confusing because Curry's original property was actually on 7th Avenue. So that's really made it difficult for me to figure out exactly where that property was. But modern day South 7th Street is South Holiday Drive for those in Seaside. Or if you're just familiar with Seaside. So we had a name, J.W. Curry, and I'll talk a little bit about him later, or maybe leave that for towards the end. We had kind of a time period when the camp operated, and the one thing that we didn't have, though, was photographs. And as I said earlier, there were photos in our story that I had a pretty good inkling were taken at the Sunflower Camp, but it was really difficult to kind of say definitively without some proof. And in looking through those newspaper articles, I found it. This is actually a later photograph that I came across later. This was actually used in a Portland Observer article. This was one of the few places that I found an actual secondary source that talked about the Sunflower Camp. But in the 1970s, someone wrote an article about the Sunflower Camp and featured this photograph and identified pretty much everyone in the image. The three people I was most interested in were actually J.W. Curry. He's standing in the center. His daughter, Clotilde, who is to his right, seated, kind of in the center. And then the dapper young man on the left in the white coat, Edward Watson. And when I saw that name, immediately I realized it triggered something. And Portland State University, in the Rutherford collection, has several albums featuring photographs that were taken by Edward Watson. And I went back, looked through, and there were photos of him in a bathing suit at the beach, having a good time. The impression I got was that he had a car and was kind of on the hook to drive folks to the coast for various outings. And he visited many times over the years. There are dates that are attached to each of them. But there was one image in particular that I was interested in. That's the image on the right. And as you can see, that is Edward Watson, same fella in the photograph before, standing in front of a cottage. And at this point, I'd seen a few cottages. I'd made some wrong guesses. This one I felt pretty good about, though. And just in kind of looking at the photograph and kind of comparing it against newspaper articles in the Advocate from 1930, I was able to locate a wedding announcement. And as you can see, in the middle, there is a photograph that accompanied the wedding announcement. And it explicitly said in the article that J.W. Curry gifted a honeymoon stay in what he called his honeymoon cottage, which is really the Hollywood cottage that, I think was the main one on the site. But he gifted this couple a stay on their honeymoon. And looking through the articles, it says that they went. You can see the society column where it outlines that they went, they stayed there, they visited, and even tells when they came back. So we know they were there roughly Memorial Day weekend 1930. And just being able to put all that information together, I was able to, pretty much say definitively that here we are looking at a photo of the Sunflower Camp and the main cottage where folks stayed. And Chris Ruiz at the Museum of Natural and Cultural History over at the University of Oregon, he and I looked at a few other photographs, and there were some others that we were, pretty sure about and we're still investigating. But there was one in particular that was also in the Our Story collection that was not a part of the Rutherford collection at PSU that I was, I'd always thought, this one could also be the same place. But it's a little, looks a little bit different. And I was really kind of struggling with whether or not this was included in, this should be included in the collection until I noticed something. But I'll get to that in a moment. I did want to talk a little bit about where this photograph comes from. This is a photograph taken presumably by Gwendolyn Hooker, who was also part of a well-known Portland family. Her brother George, I believe, served in World War I with George Fletcher, the famous black cowboy. Her family was fairly well known around town. She and her sister Violet appeared on the radio on KGW with Beatrice Morrow Kennedy, singing songs, playing music, and basically reciting famous speeches. And they were very well known around town, operated I believe, a flower shop as well. But that's a bit of an A-side. That's just a little more information I'd like to give about my subjects. But either way, we have this photograph, and I searched the newspapers, and I really couldn't find too many instances where I could say definitively that Gwendolyn or Violet Hooker stayed at the Sunflower Camp. So I was a little disappointed until I noticed something. And that is, if you look at the photograph from the honeymoon, in that window right there, there's a curtain with a distinctive butterfly pattern. And I zoomed in and looked on that last photograph, and I noticed it's the exact same pattern. And just from looking, as you can see on the photo on the right, there's significant wear and tear. Honestly, that photograph in 1930 was taken probably in the second to last year of the camp's operation. And I'm guessing the photo on the left was taken quite a bit earlier. I was able to place Gwendolyn Hooker at the Sunflower Camp pretty much the week before the photo on the right and the honeymoon. But I don't believe this photograph is from that visit because, of course, there's a few differences in the photograph. You notice there's a tree stump in one. I can't quite tell if there's a tree stump in the other, but it doesn't quite look like it. And, of course, the paint is peeling in the 1930 photograph. So I'm still trying to do a little bit more research to determine exactly when this photograph on the left was taken, and also who's featured in the photograph. I have a few leads, but that's still research for another day. But just in kind of going through all this information, going through newspaper articles, and applying some research skills, I was able to identify photographs that I am very confident are of the Sunflower Camp, and our research actually continues. We're working with a few different partners, including Oregon Black Pioneers and the Clatsop County Historical Society, to possibly develop an exhibit and continue doing this research so we can uncover some more stories and maybe some more images of the Sunflower Camp. And just to kind of summarize, the Sunflower Camp was a pre-Green Book leisure property that catered to a Black clientele. And I really would like to write a journal article. In fact, I started making an outline for it and kind of had a few false starts and stops that kind of outlines this idea of constructing a middle-class identity through leisure activities, specifically summering at the coast, and how Black Americans kind of figure into this kind of construction of a middle-class identity, and then ways in which they were denied or obtained access to this kind of identity construction. We have a lot of examples of Black beaches and Black vacation properties, places like Idlewild in Michigan. I believe there was another one in New Jersey, another one kind of in the DC area, and also a property in Los Angeles that operated at periods. And there's been a lot of research about them, books written, things like that. I'd like to do the same for the Sunflower Camp and kind of tell the story a little more thoroughly. And I also want to point out, it is very likely that there are other photographs of the Sunflower Camp that have not been identified. In fact, I believe that the folks who have these photos right now at Portland State University, and the other photograph I forgot to mention was from the Blue Sky Gallery. I'm not sure if they're aware of their provenance, which is something else that I probably need to get on and speak with those folks about. And what's the significance of this? How does this change our understanding of Oregon's Black history? For me, this complicates the story of leisure at the coast, specifically the fact that there were times when Black folks did not have access to accommodations. And I really think it's a good example of Black agency in someone like J.W. Curry in creating a space for Black people to come, gather, rest, relax, and just have fun. It also, for me, illustrates the importance of digitized full runs of newspapers in researching Black history, especially before World War II. I always say that whenever you get access to a new newspaper, especially a full digitized run, it is like seeing in color for the first time. You find so many more things than you would have been able to find just from things like oral histories, especially if we're dealing with, pre-World War II, where we don't have a lot of folks who are around to kind of talk about what was going on back then. And lastly, I hope that this showcases the idea that it's always best practice to try and identify people who are in these photographs and fully tell their stories. I get that everyone really likes looking at, old photographs, and especially now with there being such a, premium placed on creating content and social media and all this other stuff. It's important to remember that these are actual people. These are, folks who have descendants, who have family, and it's important to them that we acknowledge them and celebrate them by name. Oh, and as far as next steps, what I'd really like to do is, not to be Debbie Downer, but focus on kind of doing more research using the Seaside signal, which right now I'm currently holding a reel of microfilm, which, if you've ever tried to use, man, is it not fun having to search through that stuff. That has not been digitized yet, but I do need to go through the Seaside signal and get a better idea of kind of what that would have looked like on the ground from kind of the majority perspective, the white perspective. What did they think of the Sunflower Camp, if anything? Were there cases of discrimination that we could find in Seaside? These are kind of all things that need to be further explored to kind of flesh the story out. And I would also like to delve further into biographies of folks like Edward and Rennell Watson. Um, yeah, and also to confirm the locations of JW's various real estate holdings in Seaside. There's at least one other property, possibly two, besides the Sunflower Camp that Curry operated, and I really do need to get a better idea of where those were located. And lastly, as far as next steps for folks out there, I would really, really like to see more photographs from this site identified. It's possible that people would have them as family photos, but a lot of these ended up in archives. And if anyone out there like sees a photo that has that distinctive butterfly pattern in the window of at a cottage, or pre-World War II, preferably 1923 to 1931 photographs of Black folks in tents, possibly at the coast, send them my way. And lastly, I would like to thank various folks who, over this long, strange journey, who have helped me kind of uncover and tell more of this story. Honestly, this has been, just short of a decade's worth of research. There have been so many folks who've been really generous with their time and listen to my, ranting about the Sunflower Camp. And Curry, Chris Ruiz at the University of Oregon Museum of Natural and Cultural History, Dr. Chelsea Vaughn at the Clatsop County Historical Society, Leah Griffith at the Seaside Historical Society and Museum, Tanya Hyatt. Oh, that's a typo. I am sorry, Tanya. Tanya Hyatt Evanson at the Oregon Encyclopedia, Lizzie Cleary, and Steve Greenwood at the Clackamas County Historical Society. And also, I'd like to thank Mariah, Oregon Black Pioneers, and all of you.
Well, thank you. That's so perfect. Wow. Thank you so much for sharing all of this like dedicated research that you've been doing to really showcase this untold part of Oregon and honestly like American Black history. I think there is a lot being left out about that, as you mentioned, like leisure becoming more popular in the early 19th century and people creating their identity through that. I think you're absolutely right that that is often, especially the Black history related to it, is left out. So it's really cool to see just how clear through like the society pages and stuff like that, that kind of idea is. So just thank you so much. For sharing all of this information. I have one thing that I just like really have to get out because it was one of the, like it came up during the presentation. You mentioned that Portland's early Black community was, pretty small, and that when you do enough research, you get to see these names pop up all the time as like familiar faces, the usual suspects, so to speak. And I think that almost makes it a little bit more fun as someone who I'm not doing nearly the level of research that you do, but getting to dive into this research and seeing the same names come up again, they become like actually familiar to you. And I feel like it allows, you to feel connected to them in a way that when it's maybe you're not seeing their name over and over again, you don't necessarily get that connection. So, and what's funny about it is it also connected to the names that you brought up in terms of support for the research, like that also feels like a somewhat small community where the usual subjects keep coming up. Like you mentioned, Kathy, which of course in the Cornerstones document, so cool that they're doing the digitization. But one of the members that worked on that was our emeritus board member, Dr. Daryl Milner, whom I'm sure you've worked with, and we're so lucky to have doing this work in the community. And it was funny. All the names that you mentioned, I know we have personally worked with to help share these stories across Oregon. So it's just symbiotic.
Kimberly Moreland also worked on Cornerstones quite a bit. And I do want to point out that Kathy Galbraith specifically, I don't want to say developed a crush on George Kennedy, but she was very sympathetic to George Kennedy and didn't quite like how Beatrice Morrow was treating him. So that was something we actually talked about as well. So yeah, just kind of like in doing this research, when you see these names, yeah, they do become very familiar. In fact, in doing this research, I found out that Clotilda Curry actually fell ill as a child, and just kind of like just explained, "Oh no, Clotilda," and that kind of became my way to like signal to my wife that I was working on this project. Was just kind of lamenting the state of Clotilda Curry. So it's kind of silly at times, but yeah, you really do kind of feel you feel like you get to know these people like in kind of an odd way. I know it's like at a distance, and with about 100 years between me and them, but yeah, it does start to feel familiar in a way that's really kind of comforting and really fun.
I love that. I'm curious. So you've been doing this research about the seaside cottages for a while. Have you ever, like now you have an idea, you seem to have recently uncovered where it may have been. Have you ever tried to explore that area or, kind of like walk in their footsteps in Seaside in particular?
I have not gotten a chance. We actually did reach out to folks in Seaside, including at the museum, to get a better idea of kind of like what would, Seaside Assembly of God, kind of what's their take on all of this. And we just haven't heard much back. I don't necessarily want to, show up and, run up on anybody. That's not cool.
Yeah.
Something I would like to do once we get like a little more information and a little more coordination with the property owners.
Cool. That's great. Well, hopefully this can be the seed that grows into, more like place-based history in Seaside. We'd love to have a tour there someday, and it might be built off of the research that you're currently doing. So that's so great. I was also curious. I wanted to know, you mentioned that you had some of the information, so I wanted to know if there was anything in particular about J.W. Curry that stood out from your research, or just more about him biographically. Maybe if you could see any of his like intentions, or how it was that he was able to be so successful at that point in time. And I'm also curious, do you know what was the downfall? Was it just the Great Depression and the timing of, what was going on more nationally and globally, or did you see anything that was a little bit more personal connected to that?
Yeah, J.W. Curry was a really interesting character. Born in 1866 in Ohio, got a job on the railroads when he was fairly young, based out of Minnesota, was traveling across the country, and met a woman in Montana, got married to her. They ended up moving to Portland and basically settling, starting a family, including Clotilda. Eventually, their marriage dissolved, which it was kind of funny. In reading the Observer article, I actually kind of didn't want to bring this up, but it was funny because it kind of that construction of middle-class identity, I think there was a little concern. So in the Observer article, they actually didn't mention the couple had divorced, even though I've seen tons of evidence that suggested that Violet Curry did actually remarry after divorcing JW. But he and Clotilda were always very close. And as far as kind of like how this ended up happening, I really do think that it is just the railroads. I know you all have been working on a project involving Union Station. And just in kind of like watching the documentary that Michael Chappie Grice did, I think in the early 80s, and just kind of talking to Mr. Grice himself, who unfortunately passed away somewhat recently. But yeah, that was always a story of kind of like Black railroad porters. These were really good jobs. They were tough. They were demanding. You're away from your family a lot, but you actually could make a pretty good amount of money, and you just got to see the world. You got to see different things, got access to different newspapers like the Chicago Defender. So I think Curry just kind of like, between going back and forth to Seaside and just knowing that there was another way and other things and other possibilities, and having the financial means to do so, just kind of came up with this plan.
I love it. that totally does make sense that it would connect to that really deep, rich railroad history within the Black community. And I feel like those are also where you can find a lot of those usual suspects, the people that were working for the railroad. Now, we have some questions that came up in the chat, and so I wanted to make sure to address those. One of the questions was, you mentioned the Green Book. I think you mentioned that this is one of the, like a pre-Green Book example of, available opportunities to folks. But it sounded like Badger's Inn was like lasted beyond this particular location, but beyond the Seaside camps. So why do you think, Badger's Inn, or if there were any other locations that you know of on the coast at that time, like weren't included in the Green Book? Have you come across any sort of research that would, explain that a little bit?
Not really. I've kind of left the research to William Badger, to the folks at the Clatsop County Historical Society. They've done a wonderful job. Anytime I need information, I usually go to them for it. And because this property ceased to exist in 1931-32, I just didn't look it up. I believe the first Green Book was published in 1938. And to your previous question, as far as I can tell, the dissolution actually occurred because J.W. Curry, I believe, lost his job with the railroad during the Great Depression, and the camp just went away. It was foreclosed. He actually declared bankruptcy. I did see the notice for that in the Oregonian. And in later years, he turns up, I believe, working at a barber shop in Astoria.
Oh.
I need to check that again. In fact, it's the only time I'm going to look down on my notes.
No worries. I mean, just goes to show how much you know this information and how much you've really been, head deep in it, neck deep for years now.
Yeah, but he ended up in Astoria in 1936. And I believe passed away, in 1942, unfortunately, at the Oregon State Hospital. And I didn't mention it before, but for years I was on the Oregon Commission for Historic Cemeteries. And one of the things we really wanted to do was kind of highlight stories of Black people who are buried in historic cemeteries. The problem that we run into in a lot of cases, though, is that most historic cemeteries haven't been around long, or most cemeteries where Black people are buried haven't been around long enough to be considered historic. I forget what the rolling period is, but I believe it's 80 years. And yeah, so I was always looking for stories of folks who were buried in Oregon. And J.W. Curry was actually interred in Los Angeles, of all places, because Clotilda ended up graduating from UCLA and making a life down there. She actually married a well-known civil rights lawyer. And as best I can tell, it was just a matter of, in order to, make sure there was someone to look after, where he was interred, they brought him to Southern California. So yeah, I was kind of a bit bummed to learn that he wasn't buried in Oregon, because he has this great connection to Seaside and Portland, and you can also just see him incidentally turn up in the Advocate as well. Just things like flirting down at the candy shop or at the drugstore, or hanging out with his buddies, or playing music. He was he lived a very full life here in Oregon, and was a really kind of great example of kind of that pre-World War II Black generation that settled here and made lives.
Love that. So awesome. Another question that we have from the chat is, what can you tell us about the Advocate's Seaside area correspondence?
What the best I can tell from what was going on, it was just people who were just staying there at the coast. Okay. And in some cases, that would just be Beatrice Morrow Kennedy, as best I can tell, possibly writing under a pseudonym.
Even better. I didn't know. Is there evidence that she may have been writing under pseudonyms that you've come across? Or
the name of the person who writes some of those society columns, I can't find them listed anywhere else. In doing this research, it's always kind of funny. It's the same tools you would use to do genealogy, and I've looked on Ancestry, and in some cases I can't really identify the names that are used. So it's possibly that she's using a pen name and writing those herself. But I believe it was just whoever happened to be on staff working for the newspaper, and there, in a lot of cases, I think it just was Beatrice Morrow Kennedy.
That makes sense. She was all over doing everything, so I'm not surprised that it may have just very well been her.
And
I
actually,
also love that she's connected to the story because she's so great. What were you
yeah,
gonna say?
it's kind of funny. The only secondary source that I could find besides Cornerstones of the Community with a mention of Sunflower Camp was actually the biography of Beatrice Morrow Kennedy that was written.
Oh
It's just
wow.
honestly, it's literally a footnote or an end note, like in buried way at the end of the book. But yeah, it's just kind of funny how it really is this kind of small, tight knit world, and you can kind of see all these like actors kind of you know enjoying their lives and having fun, which is something you don't necessarily think of with about people in history. But yeah, they're people just like any of us.
Yeah, exactly. I kind of really love that about your about this particular research that you've done because it's really shining a light on just life and the beautiful, ways that people were connecting and building community in a time when we really don't get to talk about that very often for these community members. Like Beatrice was fighting back against a lot of really open vitriol and hate, but she was still finding the time to go and enjoy the coast like we all do. And there's something like so beautiful and I just really think, connects us through time in a way that other historical research doesn't necessarily do. Like, yeah, I was on the coast this weekend. Like, how weird to think about how it all, like, I may have been walking in a place that they were exploring themselves 100 years ago, which is just wild. Uh, so I feel like we're getting close to the end, and I want to make sure that you have time to share if there were any additional things that you wanted to take this time to share with us. Anything you're working on or hope to continue to uncover with that microfilm that I know you're dealing with now. Oh, thank you for showing it.
Yeah, and, it's actually kind of tough. Like, I think there are only a handful of microfilm machines like in Portland, and the library that actually lent this to me actually didn't have a microfilm reader. So then I'm now having to like run around town. Shout out to University of Portland and their library for allowing me to get a community card and use their microfilm reader.
Oh. Yes, thank you, University of Portland.
But yeah, just in general, working on a few different projects. Developing an exhibit with Zachary at Oregon Black Pioneers and Dr. Vaughn at the Placer County Historical Society. Discussed with Chris Ruiz the possibility of maybe teaming up on a journal article. Not sure what that's going to look like. Specifically for Oregon Historical Society and Oregon Historical Quarterly. And I've also written an encyclopedia entry for the Oregon Encyclopedia that'll hopefully go live sometime in the next, let's say, 4 months.
Okay,
so, yeah,
cool.
This is definitely something I'm. It's kind of the difficult thing about being an independent historian. Unless you can find, someone who's willing to pay you to do this kind of research, you kind of have to do it between projects. And yeah, so it's just a matter of kind of like getting enough momentum to keep projects like this going. So
absolutely,
yeah. I'm definitely going to make more time to investigate this more, get in touch with those various folks that are holding photographs that we know are of the Sunflower Camp, and then do some follow-up to see if we can't find any additional photographs. That's kind of my focus moving forward. And also getting in touch with the good folks over at the Seaside Museum and the folks in Seaside to just try to work a little more to kind of commemorate this place and really kind of bring more community awareness to it.
Perfect, because they did say in the chat, we'd love to work with you at the Seaside Museum. So, yes, so that's perfect. I'm glad to see that. And, we have a bi-monthly blog post called The Quest Continues. So for all that work that you're working on as things become, uncovered and you're able to share them, we'll hopefully be able to share them through that platform too. So we are happy that we are able to showcase this story and the research that you've been doing this whole time. And so, you pretty much answered these questions, or, answered the questions that I typically ask in your presentation. But just to sum it all up, if you don't mind, like a quick overview of the question that I got to ask every episode, how has what you uncovered changed our understanding of this history?
Just in looking at it in Oregon Historical Quarterly and just around, when you look at kind of the historiography of just leisure in general, not just Black leisure, I don't think there's been a ton that's been written. So this could be kind of a new avenue for us to explore as historians in the state, as far as looking at just how people spend their leisure time, not just with properties like this, But yeah, I think in general, this is something that I think historians, scholars, anyone interested in history, something just to really think about is that folks live very full lives, and just like, you know, you or anyone else, like they needed time to unwind, and what they did in their time off was really kind of a conscious reflection of their values and who they were, in the same way that I wreck my life over soccer, and that's important to me. Yeah, there are folks who, you know, love going fishing, you know, love playing croquet.
Or playing croquet. Yeah, exactly.
Miniature golf. There was also a very hot miniature golf tournament as well that occurred.
Wow.
So yeah.
Okay. Love that. That's so fun.
But yeah, it's just telling the whole story, and not just, you know, I don't want to say the bad things, because, you know, we should focus on kind of the negative things that happen in Black history, especially, you know, in a place like Oregon that has, you know, such a past of exclusion, things like that. But let's also remember there were Black people who were here and built lives. It's one thing that I really don't like, is when people talk about Black exclusion as if it was actually effective. You know, Black people still live here. Like, there were, you know, it was a very small population, you know, before World War II, 1,500 in Portland, 2,000 in the whole state. But these people were here, and they made lives, and they had fun, and they got married, and lived like anyone else.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's also a good reminder that we all do need to take time to like relax, you know, even if we're dealing with some of the same issues somehow a century later. Part of doing that work is, you know, taking the time to for yourself. So hopefully you get a chance to do that sometime soon, and maybe go visit this, you know, where it once was. We won't make a big deal out of it, though.
It'll all go back to fishing, I think. I really do just need to get my like sports pack for the year, and like actually get serious about going down there and beating up on some salmon.
Yeah, that'll have to be one of the updates for, you know, the History Quest, if it's good fishing over there, like today. So you'll have to let us know.
Will do.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you so much for this incredible research and the time that you shared with us tonight. You know, it really means a lot to be able to showcase this, and it's fantastic to get to partner with you as someone who's been doing this research, you know, in the community alongside us for decades. So it's great to have this opportunity to work together.
Most certainly. Likewise. Thanks for having me. And yeah, it's been great to present this stuff. As you can see, I've been holding on to this information for a while, and now I'm ready to get it out there.
Yes. So excited. Can't wait to see what comes next. And it has just been so wonderful learning from you this evening. Thank you. Thank you again.
You're welcome. And thank you.
All right. Well, that'll do it for this episode of Black History Quest. As always, we want to thank the Collins Foundation for sponsoring this show, and make sure to learn more about them and the projects that they support at thecollinsfoundation.org. And of course, Oregon Black Pioneers depends on the support of ordinary people like you who believe in sharing the stories of Oregon's Black history. So if you enjoyed this show, and would like to support it and others like it, please consider a donation to Oregon Black Pioneers through our website. And if you have any questions about this episode, or want to become a history investigator yourself, please send an email to hello@OregonBlackPioneers.org. Now, stay tuned for the next episode of Black History Quest in July, where, as always, we'll try to answer that question: how can one source change history? Thank you so much for joining us, and good night.